In a world where everyone is racing to be heard, where voices clash louder than truths, and silence is mistaken for weakness, there's a kind of power that's almost invisible. But once you discover it, no one can take it away. It's not the power to dominate. It's not the power to convince, control, or correct. It's the power to remain still when the storm begins to howl. You see, we live in an age of emotional volatility. One glance at your phone and someone's already offended. One careless word and someone else explodes. It's as if the whole world has become a battlefield of reactions, arguments fired like arrows, judgments thrown like grenades. And in this battlefield, the loudest often appear to win. But if you look closer, the real winner is the one who never stepped into the fight. There's a quote often attributed to the Buddha: "You will not be punished for your anger. You will be punished by your anger." Let that settle into your bones for a moment. Because the truth is, every time you react with fury, every time you let someone else's chaos pull you out of alignment, you give them the keys to your peace. You hand over your inner kingdom for free. But what if you could reclaim it? What if, instead of being triggered by every passing insult or inconvenience, you could watch it float by, like a leaf drifting across a still pond? Imagine that. Imagine being so centered, so deeply rooted in your own awareness that nothing could shake you. Not because you're numb, but because you've mastered the art of not being pulled in. That's the essence of Buddhist wisdom. It's not about escaping life. It's about engaging with life without becoming entangled by it. So let's be honest. How often have you allowed someone else's mood to dictate your own? How many times has your peace crumbled under the weight of needing to be right, needing to win, needing to defend? And every time you give in to that urge, whether it's snapping back, justifying yourself, or mentally rehearsing a clever comeback, you leave a part of your soul behind in that moment. You may win the argument, but you lose the quiet. And what is more valuable than inner stillness in a world on fire? There's a story from the Zen tradition. A student asks the master, "Master, how do I attain peace?" The master smiles and says, "Return it to yourself. You were born with peace. You were born with clarity. But somewhere along the way, we traded them for attention, for validation, for being right. It's time to return. Not backwards, but inward. To a space where power is not loud, power is presence. True strength is not how quickly you can defend yourself. It's how deeply you can remain undisturbed. And yes, it's hard. It's so hard. Especially when someone crosses a boundary, disrespects you, or triggers an old wound. But here's the quiet truth. The person who triggers you still controls you. The person you cannot forgive still holds the chain. So what does freedom look like? It looks like watching someone insult you and choosing not to pick up the rope. It looks like letting the moment pass through you instead of getting stuck in you. It looks like standing in the center of chaos and knowing that you are no longer part of it. The mind wants to react. The ego wants revenge. But the awakened heart, it wants peace. And peace, my friend, is not passive. It's fierce. It's disciplined. It's a decision made moment by moment to walk away from the noise, not because you're afraid of it, but because you no longer need it. This is not weakness. This is mastery. So if you've ever asked yourself, why do I keep getting triggered? Why does my calm always depend on other people? Why do I feel like I'm losing myself just trying to keep the peace? You're not alone, but you can change the pattern. You can train your mind not to react, but to witness, not to suppress, but to transcend. And we live in a world that constantly pulls us toward people, outcomes, possessions, and expectations. And the more tightly we hold on, the more we suffer. But what if freedom wasn't something we had to chase? What if it begins the moment we let go? The Buddha didn't teach detachment as an escape from life, but as a way to fully live it without being enslaved by it. True detachment is not indifference. It's not a cold withdrawal or an empty resignation. It is clarity. It is inner spaciousness. It's standing in the middle of the storm and realizing you don't have to be the storm. Imagine this: a bird lands on your hand. If you grip it too tightly, you harm it. If you panic and try to hold on forever, you lose the beauty of the moment. But if you're still and open, the bird may stay or it may fly away. Either way, you are free. That's detachment. Many of us confuse love with possession, goals with obsession, effort with control. But clinging is not love. Control is not peace. Wanting things to always go your way is the fastest path to suffering. The Buddha saw this clearly. Craving leads to suffering. Letting go leads to peace. It's not easy, though. Detachment challenges everything the ego is built upon: identity, desire, permanence. Our ego says, "This is mine, I must have it. I cannot lose this." But the Dhamma gently whispers, "Nothing is truly yours. Everything is borrowed, even this breath." When you start practicing detachment, it feels strange at first. You begin to loosen your grip, not out of fear, but from wisdom. You stop needing people to behave a certain way in order to feel okay. You stop forcing situations to bend to your will. You stop waiting for life to cooperate before you give yourself permission to be at peace. You become less reactive. Someone insults you, you don't have to defend. Plans change, you don't spiral. You lose something valuable, and instead of falling apart, you feel a strange calm. This is the beginning of freedom. One Zen master said, "When I let go of what I am, I become what I might be." There is profound strength in this, because only when you release the need to control everything do you start to align with the deeper rhythm of life. And yes, sometimes detachment means walking away from toxic patterns, from unspoken expectations, even from parts of yourself you once clung to. It's painful, but growth often begins where comfort ends. Detachment is not abandonment. It's a realignment with what is real, with what is present, with what truly matters. You begin to notice the subtle shifts. You're no longer addicted to outcomes. You still care, but you don't cling. You give your best, but you don't grip the result. You can enjoy a beautiful sunset without needing to capture it, possess it, or prove it to anyone. And perhaps most powerfully, you stop being chained to your own past. The mistakes, the regrets, the what-ifs, the stories you've replayed 1,000 times in your head. Detachment means choosing not to carry what's no longer meant for your hands. So pause and ask yourself now, what am I holding onto that's already trying to leave? What expectation, what attachment, what story am I gripping so tightly it's suffocating my peace? Sometimes the deepest act of strength is surrender. And as the illusion of control begins to dissolve, something extraordinary happens. You start to float. Not away from life, but into it. Lighter, clearer, freer. Because the heart that learns to let go, learns to soar. There's an old Zen saying that goes, "You cannot stop the waves, but you can learn to surf." This is the essence of what it means to observe without absorbing. Life will throw waves at you, strong ones, unexpected ones, relentless ones. But instead of drowning in them, the wise learn to ride. Let's be honest, most people don't observe. They react. Someone says something harsh, we take it personally. The world feels chaotic. We absorb the noise and let it become our inner world. And before we know it, our peace, our clarity is gone. But the teaching of the Buddha offers another way. A way that doesn't demand we shut the world out, but instead that we watch it with the calm, steady eyes of awareness. Think about a mirror. A mirror reflects everything that passes before it. It doesn't resist, doesn't hold on, doesn't get stained by what it sees. It simply allows things to come and to go. That's your mind at its purest. Reflective but unattached. Now imagine going through life like that. Someone criticizes you, not because of who you are, but because of their own pain. You observe, you don't absorb. A thought arises, fear, anger, insecurity. You witness it like clouds drifting through the sky. You don't chase them, you don't fight them. You let them float because they are not you. They are just passing guests. And you are the space in which they pass. That's powerful. You see, observation builds a cushion between you and your emotions. It allows you to pause, and in that pause lies your power. You can choose your response. You can see the truth behind behavior. You can keep your center when the world loses its own. The Buddha called this sati, mindfulness. It's not about forcing the mind to be blank. It's about being aware of what's happening without being consumed by it. Let me give you a story. One day, a monk was meditating by the riverside when a villager ran up to him, yelling and cursing for no reason. The monk stayed silent. After the man stormed off, another monk who witnessed the scene asked, "Why didn't you respond to his insults?" The monk smiled gently and said, "If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" The answer is clear. When you don't accept another's anger, it stays with them. When you don't absorb negativity, you free yourself. So, how do you cultivate this ability in a noisy world? Start simple. Next time someone irritates you, pause before reacting. Notice the tension in your body. Watch the thoughts that rise, just watch them. Name them. That's irritation, that's judgment. Don't feed them, don't push them away, just observe. Over time, this practice will become second nature. You'll find that you're no longer drowning in the emotions of others. You're no longer pulled into every storm that passes by. You're sitting in the eye of it, calm, alert, and deeply grounded. And that's not avoidance. That's mastery. Remember, being a peaceful person doesn't mean your life is free from conflict. It means you've developed the strength to remain whole, even when surrounded by brokenness. You've learned to observe the world with compassion, but not carry its chaos as your own. And that's the gift of spiritual maturity. It's not just about silence on the outside. It's about stillness on the inside, even when the noise is deafening. Now, as we carry that stillness forward, we arrive at another essential shift in consciousness. A space where suffering begins to unravel, not because life got easier, but because you stopped clinging. There's a moment, just a split second, that holds immense power. It happens right before we react, right before we speak out of anger, judge without clarity, or make a decision clouded by fear. That moment is the pause. Now most people overlook it. They rush through it. They're wired to react, not reflect. But those who train their minds, who embrace the Buddhist path of mindfulness, they learn to live inside the pause. And when they do, they uncover a power that transforms the course of their lives. Let's break it down. Imagine someone criticizes you. You feel that sting. The ego flares up, the chest tightens, the words rush to your lips. But instead of lashing out, you pause, you breathe, you observe. In that moment, you're no longer a puppet pulled by strings of habit and emotion. You become conscious, aware, free. That pause is your doorway to freedom. In Buddhist practice, this is the beginning of mastery, not of others, but of yourself. The Buddha didn't teach us to suppress our reactions or bottle them up. He taught us to observe them, to hold them in the light of awareness, and to respond, not from impulse but from wisdom. The difference between reaction and response is the pause. When you react, you're a prisoner of your past patterns. When you pause, you unlock the future. That's the magic. But here's the catch. The pause doesn't come easily. In fact, it feels unnatural at first, especially when the world moves fast, especially when your mind has been trained for years to jump, fix, argue, defend. But the pause isn't about doing nothing. It's about doing everything with presence. Let's look at nature. A tiger doesn't leap instantly, it waits, it watches, it understands timing. That stillness is not weakness, it's calculation, control, power. Similarly, when you pause, you see more clearly. You hear the words behind the words. You notice your own triggers. You give space for the heart to speak before the mouth does. And slowly, that pause becomes longer. What starts as 2 seconds turns into 5, then into 10. Then it becomes your default setting. You no longer get swept away by chaos. You become the calm in the storm. Let's go deeper. Think of the most powerful people you've ever met, not the loudest, not the flashiest, but those who make you feel safe with their silence. The ones who listen more than they speak. The ones whose presence makes you pause. Those are people who have mastered the art of their own pause. They carry peace, not because life is easy, but because they've learned to meet life from a space of clarity, not chaos. And that's the shift. Most people are stuck in survival mode. They react because they fear. They fear loss. They fear rejection. They fear being seen as weak. But once you realize that nothing truly can be taken from your core self, your awareness, you stop reacting to protect the ego and start responding from wisdom. You begin to ask, is this really worth my peace? Will reacting right now heal or harm? Can I just breathe and wait just for a moment? This isn't about avoiding action. In fact, true action rooted in wisdom, only comes after the pause. That's when your words land deeper. That's when your decisions hold weight. That's when you become less of a reactor and more of a creator of your inner world. Even in meditation, the greatest insight often doesn't come from thinking more. It comes in the space between thoughts, in the pause. That's where the mind reveals itself. That's where the soul whispers. That's where clarity lives. And the beauty is, this power is available to you, right now, in this very breath. The next time someone triggers you, try this. Don't reply, don't retaliate, don't even rush to make sense of it. Just pause, breathe, return to yourself. What you'll find isn't weakness, it's strength, stillness, superpower, because in that stillness you remember you are not your emotions. Why? There's a powerful image in Buddhist teachings that compares anger, resentment, or anxiety to a fire. And here's the truth. Fire feeds on fuel. Remove the fuel and the fire dies on its own. The problem is most of us, without even realizing it, keep feeding the fire. We do it with our thoughts, our words, our reactions. A single moment of insult, disappointment, or misunderstanding sets off an emotional spark. But instead of observing that spark and letting it pass, we fan the flames. Why did they say that? How dare they treat me like this? I should have responded differently. And so the fire grows, consuming our peace, scorching our clarity. But what if we did the opposite? What if we stopped giving the fire its fuel? In Zen Buddhism, there's no need to fight the fire. No need to yell at it, suppress it, or run from it. You simply let it burn, but you don't feed it. You watch it with stillness, with patience, with presence. And like any fire without wood, eventually, it dies. This is what letting go actually looks like. It's not passive. It's not weak. It's the ultimate inner strength. When someone insults you and you choose silence, not because you're scared, but because you're aware. When anger rises in your chest, but you don't grab onto it. When worry creeps into your mind, and instead of spiraling, you sit and you breathe. Letting the fire burn itself out means choosing non-reaction. It's the wisdom of the pause that we learned earlier, but applied to life's most heated moments. And this wisdom grows stronger with practice. You begin to realize that every fire, be it anger, jealousy, fear, or sorrow, is temporary. None of it lasts unless you feed it. And every time you resist the urge to react, every time you choose stillness over struggle, you become freer. Here's the beauty. The world may still be chaotic, but you're not. When someone cuts you off in traffic, you don't need to explode. When life doesn't go your way, you don't need to panic. When people betray, reject, or misunderstand you, you don't need revenge. You need awareness. In these moments, you are not avoiding the fire, you are transcending it. You're no longer playing the same emotional game. You are watching the storm from the mountain, not being tossed around by it. And this is where true power begins. Because the one who doesn't react has the most control. The one who doesn't fight the fire is the one who can walk through it without being burned. So next time anger rises, or fear tightens your chest, or sorrow knocks at your door, remember, you don't need to invite it in. You don't need to serve it tea and offer it space in your heart. You can simply let it pass. Let the fire burn itself out. And in that quiet aftermath, you'll feel something profound. Not just peace, but liberation. And that liberation opens the door to something deeper. A space within you that doesn't need fixing, doesn't need defending. A space that simply is. There's a kind of silence that isn't about the absence of sound. It's not about shutting out the world or escaping into isolation. This kind of silence, true silence, is presence without the noise. And in a world addicted to noise, stimulation, and endless commentary, this silence becomes a revolutionary act of wisdom. Imagine walking into a room filled with people talking over one another, everyone trying to prove a point, to win, to be right. Now imagine someone in that same room who says nothing, yet their presence feels louder than all the voices combined. That's the power of the wise. They've learned the value of speaking less, not because they're afraid, but because they've listened deeply. Not only to others, but to themselves, to life, to reality as it truly is. In Buddhist teachings, this is not passivity. It is awareness, stillness, mindful restraint. It's the understanding that most words come from the ego's need to assert itself, to defend, to control, to dominate. But the one who sees clearly realizes that silence often says more. You see, when the mind is silent, it sees. When the mouth is quiet, the heart speaks. And what it says is rarely reactive. It is intuitive, grounded, and timeless. The Zen masters knew this well. When asked a profound question, they often responded with nothing, or a gesture, a look, a sip of tea, not because they didn't have answers, but because they knew the real answer wasn't in words, it was in being, in experiencing, in awareness itself. There's a famous Zen story of a monk who asked his teacher, "What is the essence of Zen?" The master paused, then gently lifted a flower. He didn't speak, he just smiled. That smile spoke louder than 1,000 sermons. Because when you're rooted in silence, you realize most things don't need to be said. Most arguments don't need to be had. Most explanations are simply attempts to convince the mind of what the heart already knows. Think about how much energy we waste trying to have the last word, trying to defend ourselves, trying to sound wise. But the wise don't try to sound wise. They simply are. Their silence is the echo of inner peace. In silence, you begin to hear more, ironically, not just from others, but from the very core of existence. You hear what pain is trying to teach. You hear what nature whispers at sunrise. You hear what your own intuition has been softly repeating for years but drowned out by noise. And you begin to trust it. Silence is also the birthplace of clarity. When we rush to speak, we often speak from confusion. But when we wait, allow stillness to settle the dust, truth reveals itself like the moon rising from behind dark clouds. So how do you cultivate this kind of silence in a noisy world? Not by moving to a mountain, not by isolating yourself, but by carrying stillness within you, by choosing presence over reaction, by breathing before speaking, by observing the urge to fill space with words and gently choosing not to. Speak only when it improves upon the silence. Let that be your vow. Even in daily life, practice mindful speech. Before you talk, ask yourself, is this true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? If it's not all three, perhaps silence would serve better. This isn't about becoming cold or distant. It's about becoming intentional. When your words arise from a place of deep presence, they carry weight. They heal. They liberate. And sometimes your silence is the most loving answer of all. So the next time you're tempted to react, to defend, to prove something, try stillness. Try listening. Try saying nothing and simply being there. Let your presence be the sermon. Let your silence speak. Let your soul echo louder than any voice. Because those who have nothing to prove often speak the least. And they are often the ones we listen to the most. Now, imagine what happens when this kind of silence meets adverb. What if everything you've been fighting wasn't your enemy? What if the very pain you've tried to silence, the imperfections you've tried to fix, the storms you've tried to outrun, were never meant to be conquered, but embraced? Radical acceptance isn't about giving up. It's about showing up for life just as it is. It's the moment you stop arguing with reality and start flowing with it. And in that shift, something extraordinary happens. You stop suffering. You see pain is inevitable. Loss, aging, failure, disappointment, they are all threads in the fabric of being human. But suffering, that comes from our resistance. The stories we tell ourselves. This shouldn't be happening. This isn't fair. I can't take this. Each one builds a wall between us and peace. Radical acceptance is the quiet act of saying, yes, this is what's here right now. I may not like it. I may wish it were different. But I will meet it with presence, not protest. And that changes everything. Imagine this, a storm rolls in. The winds howl, the rain beats down. Most people run, seek shelter, curse the sky. But the Zen monk, he sits, still. He doesn't invite the storm, but he also doesn't resist it. He lets it pass through him. And when it's over, the world is clean again. That is the spirit of radical acceptance. It's not passivity. It's profound clarity, the realization that reality, just as it is, holds the seed of peace if we stop trying to reshape it to fit our ideals. Buddha taught, pain is certain, but suffering is optional. And radical acceptance is the path to that option. It doesn't mean you approve of injustice or condone harm. It means you stop layering extra suffering on top of the wound. This practice is especially powerful when applied inward. So many of us walk through life with a quiet war raging inside, ashamed of our fears, angry at our mistakes, haunted by old decisions. But what if we stopped? What if we turned to those fractured parts of ourselves and said, I see you, I understand why you're here, and you're allowed to be. Suddenly the war ends, and from the ashes something whole emerges. This is not just emotional wisdom, it's neurological. Resistance floods the body with cortisol, hijacks the nervous system, keeps us locked in fight or flight. Acceptance does the opposite. It activates the parasympathetic system, the rest and digest state. Our breath slows. Our heart steadies. Our awareness widens. And our choices become clearer. One of the greatest illusions is that we need control to feel safe. But the deeper truth is, we need acceptance to feel free. Because the more we try to control, the more life resists us. But the more we accept, the more life begins to flow with us. This is not weakness. This is strength of the rarest kind. To meet a broken world with an open heart. To walk into the unknown without armor. To look at what hurts and stay. Radical acceptance is not the end of feeling. It's the beginning of feeling fully without the distortion of judgment. It's how we stop being victims of our experiences and start being witnesses of them, wise, compassionate, and free. There's a reason the lotus flower, symbol of Buddhist awakening, grows from mud. It doesn't bloom despite the mud, but because of it. And in the same way, Your peace won't bloom once everything is perfect. It will bloom when you stop resisting the mess and start meeting it with mindfulness. So the next time you feel the urge to fight what is, pause, breathe, and ask gently, what if I didn't need this to change for me to be at peace? Because sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do is to say a full, unconditional yes to life, as it is, not as it should be. And from there, the real transformation begins. There's something profoundly powerful about a mind that doesn't scatter. Most people think transformation comes with thunder, fire, and drama, like a lightning bolt striking the heart and turning life around. But in Buddhism, real transformation often begins in silence and grows through focus. Focused energy is not loud and it doesn't seek applause. It doesn't make a scene. It simply works quietly, invisibly, like roots deep beneath the surface, growing stronger each day. Imagine this: you pour a glass of water into the sand. What happens? It disappears, scattered in all directions. Now imagine pouring that same water into a narrow bamboo pipe. It shoots forward with force. That's the difference between a scattered mind and a focused one. Many of us spend our lives leaking energy through overthinking, multitasking, emotional reactions, and endless mental commentary. We live distracted and we wear our stress like a second skin. We wonder why we feel tired, uninspired, anxious. But no river flows with power unless it is directed. The Buddha understood this deeply. In the Pali Canon, it said that the mind is radiant, but it becomes stained by passing defilements. When we reclaim our energy from distractions, when we no longer waste it chasing every desire or fighting every thought, something incredible happens. We begin to remember who we really are. Pure, clear, powerful. Focused energy is not just about concentrating on a task. It's about bringing your full presence to this moment, whether you're sweeping the floor, listening to a friend, or simply breathing. It's about being where your feet are, not lost in imagined futures or replayed pasts. The more you can return to now, the more your energy becomes sharp, bright, and transformative. In meditation, this focus becomes even more potent. At first, it's hard. The mind jumps, the body itches, the thoughts scream for attention. But with gentle persistence, focus becomes effortless. It stops being something you do and instead becomes something you are. You start to live with a different quality of awareness, less reactive, more deliberate. And that's where real growth happens. There's a Zen story of a student who asked his master, "What is enlightenment?" The master replied, "When hungry, eat. When tired, sleep." The student was puzzled. "But don't we all do that?" The master shook his head. "No. When you eat, your mind is on 1,000 things. When I eat. That's the power of focused energy, total engagement, wholehearted presence. And from that presence, something remarkable begins to emerge. You stop being a victim of chaos. You stop being ruled by fear or temptation. You begin shaping your life quietly with precision and peace. And what's more beautiful, you don't even need to announce it. Because when your energy becomes still and focused, people can feel it. You walk into a room and others calm down. You speak less, but your words carry weight. You listen more, but your gaze feels like truth. You become grounded, trustworthy, magnetic. Focused energy is the silent revolution. You don't need to fix the world. You just need to stop scattering yourself. In this stillness, the real transformation begins, not with effort, but with alignment. And now, we move closer to the heart of it all. There's a quiet transformation that doesn't come from books, from retreats, or from grand spiritual breakthroughs. It comes from doing the simple things again and again and again. It's in your morning breath. It's in the way you drink your tea. It's in the few seconds you take before replying to someone. These are the tiny spaces where the untouchable mind is forged. You don't need to live in a monastery to master your mind. You just need to show up every single day. Let's be real. The world won't stop spinning. People will still interrupt you, disappoint you, betray you, try to control you, or just drain your energy without even knowing it. But here's the truth most people miss. Life doesn't need to change for you to find peace. What needs to change is the way you relate to it. The practice is not about escaping life. It's about learning to remain undisturbed right in the middle of it. When you train your mind daily, not once a week, not when things fall apart, but consistently, you start to recognize that your peace is not up for negotiation. Your energy becomes focused like a blade, and your reactions become choices, not reflexes. You begin to sense disturbances before they even enter your space, and you learn to guard your inner world the way a temple guards its flame. That doesn't mean you never feel angry, sad, or triggered. It means those emotions no longer hijack your entire being. You begin to feel them rise, and you meet them with curiosity, not chaos. You give them space without surrendering your power to them. And that strength doesn't come from being special, it comes from being committed. Every day you practice being aware. You sit with your breath. You observe your thoughts without grabbing onto them. You listen to people without letting their energy leak into your own. You pause when you're about to react. You walk slowly when you're rushing inside. These are not grand acts, but repeated enough times, they create a foundation so solid that even the strongest emotional storms can't shake it. Remember this, you don't become untouchable by hardening yourself. You become untouchable by becoming deeply present, by being fully aware. That awareness makes you flexible like water, soft, but impossible to grasp or break. One day, someone will say something cruel to you, and you'll feel no need to respond. Not because you're weak, but because you've outgrown the impulse to be disturbed. That's the moment you'll realize your inner work has become muscle memory. You've done it not for applause, not to impress anyone, but because you were tired of being at the mercy of everything and everyone around you. This practice, this daily devotion to your own peace, is not about perfection. It's about persistence. And with that, you're not just surviving anymore. You're thriving, calmly, silently, powerfully. And when people wonder what changed, you'll smile. Because the answer isn't out there. It's in every breath, every pause, every choice you made when no one was watching. The transformation has already begun. There comes a moment in everyone's life when we stop chasing strength outside of ourselves and begin to look inward, into the vast, quiet chamber of the mind, where true power has always been waiting. Self-mastery isn't about dominating your emotions or suppressing your impulses like a stone-faced monk. No, it's about understanding yourself so deeply that the storms outside no longer dictate your peace within. It's knowing your triggers, holding space for your pain, and choosing, again and again, not to let it control you. You may not be able to control how others treat you. You may not be able to stop the chaos of the world, but you can master the way you respond. You can train your attention like a blade. You can choose stillness over reactivity, patience over urgency, silence over noise. And the more you do this, the more you realize nothing can truly shake you, because you are not what happens to you. You are the space in which it all happens. The pause, the watcher, the one who chooses presence even in discomfort. This is self-mastery, not perfection, not escape, but presence. It's not about escaping pain. It's about becoming the one who knows pain, watches it, and no longer fears it. It's not about always being calm. It's about becoming aware of when you are not and returning to calm by choice, not habit. Every insight from this journey, from stillness, detachment, observation, silence, to radical acceptance, has led to this. When you no longer seek validation, you become free. When you no longer react, you become untouchable. And when you no longer fear your own inner world, you become powerful. And that power, my friend, is quiet. It doesn't boast. It doesn't need to win. It just is. Let the world do what it does. You return to center again and again. That's the practice. That's the path. And that's where your true liberation begins. If this journey stirred something deep within you, if it reminded you of a truth you've always known but maybe forgot, then I invite you to walk with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism, wisdom for timeless teachings, stories that open the heart, and insights that bring you home to yourself. And if today's words offered you even a moment of stillness, consider sharing it with someone else who may need it. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more quiet power. Yours. See you in the next journey.